Hello, everyone.
Good evening, Tom.
Good evening, Scott. How you doing?
Just splendid. How are you doing?
I'm doing the same.
Excellent.
Not
Good
sure-
evening.
Evening.
I know.
Not sure about tomorrow. They say hurricane winds, eh? And I've
Oh, we
already-
did.
And I've already had massive tree damages already on my properties. I don't need another one.
What part of the city, Tom?
I live in the Peon, I just off Fallowfield and Cedarview.
Hmm.
I had about 5 on one side of the 5 50-footers, all spruce and pine. And then I had 2 that were leaning, that were 50-footers. In fact, I just had a crane leave the house this morning. Had to pull it out of the ground. It was leaning so badly. It's been a costly storm for me.
Mhm.
It's the trouble when you have a tree lot.
Just a reminder for those joining the committee, you'll need to accept the prompt to be promoted to panelist.
Good afternoon, everyone.
For those joining the meeting, you'll need to accept the prompt to be promoted to panelist.
So technically, our committee has 15 members, which makes quorum 8. But at the same time, our committee actually has 13 members. So I don't know how much flexibility I have with quorum rules, because we do say that it's supposed to be 15. But 7 to me is a quorum of this committee based on the fact that council removed two member. Well, council removed one member, and one member stepped down at the same time. So I don't know, Eric, if I have the luxury of declaring 7 of 13 quorum.
Sounds like you've ruled chair, so
Excellent.
that's
Good.
where it stops.
I don't imagine anyone's going to challenge the chair on my quorum ruling. Regardless, Aileen is supposed to attend. We do have some regrets from a couple members, 3 members in particular. But Aileen did mention that they would be here, and we have another member arriving likely a little later, closer to 6. So we will go ahead. If you recall, in past discussions at a couple of our previous meetings, we did talk about a couple things, and I asked if there'd be interest in receiving more information about some of the files that the city had been working on, because they kept on coming up in discussions at this advisory committee. So while tonight isn't exactly speaking about anything that's earth-shattering or upcoming on the council agenda, the 3 things are sort of living, breathing documents that the city has that will be updated in the future as we go. So it's not that while these are all previously approved by council, these are all things that will continue to develop. In fact, the high performance development standards, we have a site plan. We have a site plan report coming forward, which does include adaptation of some of the high performance development standards into our site plan policies. So this stuff is still very relevant, even though it's previously approved. It's still worthy of discussion. I think it's helpful, and especially when the fact that we record these meetings and they're available for public consumption after the fact. I do think having a good discussion with multiple groups from showing a representing a cross section of the city, I think is helpful, because they are things that we end up doing. You know, these are reports that come to. In fact, I think they went to 3 different committees based on the nature of them. The high performance development standard, maybe I'm wrong, but nonetheless, it's at least went to FedCo and Planning Committee. I know that, and Environment Committee kind of has a role in this stuff, but it doesn't necessarily get approved at Environment Committee, but they certainly come all through it. So while we definitely have the quorum that I've since declared, I wanted to well, first of all, obviously I'll call the meeting to order. I guess we will do a roll call just for formality's sake. So Eric, I don't know if you want to do that. I can do it if you want.
Chair, I'm available. Member Bassett. Member Duncan, who I believe just joined.
Oh, yeah, there she is. She's here on mute, but I mean, that wave is a clear here.
Member Esau. Member Kirkpatrick. Member Mackenzie.
Here.
Member Moss.
Here.
Member Renfro.
Here.
Member Schellenberg.
Also here.
Member Smith. And Member Tarasyuk. You have quorum, Chair.
Thanks. I'm also here.
Oh, yes, and apologies. Vice Chair Al-Rifai also in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I go through you went through the list of public members and then forgot the top 3 there. It's okay, Eric. We'll let it slide. I won't put this in your semi-annual review that I don't do. Okay, declaration of interest. Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes for our previous 2 meetings. So our November 10th, 2021 meeting and our March 2nd, 2022 meeting. Can we confirm those minutes? Yes, thank you so much. Minutes confirmed. So what we have today, again, so we're getting report updates from the relevant. Oh, sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
Thanks, Scott. I guess just a request. You and I have had just a bit of an exchange following on from the November meeting. And I'm just wondering if it would be possible in the minutes that where there's a request to to staff, I guess, for information. I don't know if it's appropriate, but if it might be useful to include that request in the minutes, just so we don't lose track of those requests, because I believe that we did sort of lose track of one of the queries that I had back in November about the discussion papers, and that might be a useful way of making sure that that doesn't happen. Anyway, so that's a suggestion for the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, Eric, is that noted so that when committee makes a recommendation or a request for information, further information, that we make sure we document that properly in the minutes?
Can do, Chair. So just to clarify, the minutes as presented for the past 2 meetings are confirmed.
Yes.
And if there's any requests for directions this meeting, they would be explicitly noted in the minutes.
Perfect. Okay, so the items we have tonight, high performance development standard, better buildings, Ottawa strategy, and better homes loan program. So again, these are things that have come up both at our November and March meetings in discussion on the items that were on those agendas. So I thought it would be, again, useful for a presentation from the relevant staff, because we didn't have the relevant staff in those discussions. So we will start with the high performance development standards, which I believe is Rebecca Hagan.
Yes, thank you. Would you like me to take it away?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
If I could also just, I noticed that Janice is also in the attendees. If she could accept the prompt, if she's intending to be a panelist, and I'll screen share the presentation whenever requested.
Sure, you can screen share presentation, and Janice will be presenting the following 2 presentations, so I can get started while she gets herself organized. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm here to talk about the high performance development standard. We can move on to the next slide. So I'll go over just a high level background of why having a high performance development standard, what the high performance development standard is, and some of the next steps that we're working on for the high performance development standard. So next slide. So high performance development standard, it's also known as a green standard. Municipalities across Ontario are implementing similar types of things. It's applied through the development approval process using the Planning Act authorities for site plan application and plan of subdivision. It's aimed to advance sustainable and resilient design, covering the subject matters in that imagery there. The standard itself is made up of 2 tiers, tier 1 being mandatory for applicable applications, and tier 2 being voluntary and encouraged. Next slide. So as mentioned previously, there are a number of Ontario municipalities that have adopted green development standards. There's a few listed here, and actually, since we did this review, I've heard from a number of others that have them either coming forward or under development currently. So there's more coming in the coming years. So the oldest one being Toronto, which was first adopted as voluntary in 2006 and then mandatory in 2010. So next slide. So the high performance development standard, it's kind of the coming together of our climate projections work, our energy evolution work, and our draft official plan work. So the draft official plan lays out the enabling policy framework to enable the high performance development standard, and the subject matter that the high performance development standard covers really seeks to address the energy evolution targets and the concerns coming out of the climate projections around resiliency and adapting to the changing climate. It was approved by Council in April of this year, and it's coming into effect when the new official plan is approved. So at the moment, that is with the province, and we are not quite sure on the exact timing of that. So it's a little bit to be determined at the moment. Next slide. At a high level, I mentioned previously, the high performance development standard is enabled through our Planning Act authorities, so driven by provincial policy statements that advance energy conservation and measures to adapt to climate change. And then our official plan policy sets out the framework to enable the high performance development standard, and the high performance development standard sets out the mandatory and optional metrics for both plan of subdivision and site plan control. Next slide. So this sort of just goes into, at a high level, what's the difference between a standard and a guideline. So essentially, if we think of the spectrum of zoning bylaws being highly specific and highly mandatory with a rigorous process for nonconformity, and guidelines being a little bit more subjective, the standard sort of falls in the middle of that, where it's highly specific, but it's not quite as rigorous a process if there are scenarios where alternative compliance paths or other types of measures want to be proposed. So it sort of falls in the middle there in terms of level of prescriptiveness of the standard. Next slide. The high performance development standard, it will not apply to construction projects that are building permit only. Tier 1 of the standard applies to site plan and plan of subdivision. Tier 2 is completely voluntary, which we'll be looking at proposing possible incentive options in the coming next term of council. And for city projects, they're subject to the green building policy, which we've received direction on to update and align with the high performance development standard. Next slide. So as mentioned previously, there's three tiers to the standard. Tier 1 is mandatory and tier 2 is voluntary. And then the intent of the tiers as it relates to the energy performance metric is for them to lay out the path towards where we need to get to for our energy evolution targets. So over the next 10 years or so, we'll see updates to the standard with the expectation that tier 2, the current tier 2 will become the next version of the standards tier 1, and we'll step up the requirements over time in that fashion. Next slide. So the benefits of the standard, it's aiming to help grow the green job sector, both in design and construction, help build capacity to meet the future building code changes, including anticipated targets for near zero emission buildings by 2030, help to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, improve public health outcomes, and reduce negative community impacts as a result of extreme heat events, as well as set out improved soil volume standards for Ottawa's tree canopies. Next slide. At a high level, there are a number of metrics in the standard. These are the high level categories that it covers. So energy, water, waste, transportation, climate resiliency, health, and ecology. Next slide, I'll go into at a brief description of what's covered for site plan and plan of subdivision. So under site plan, under tier 1, there are 12 metrics. They're all listed here. I'm not going to read them out for you. This slide deck can certainly be distributed after the presentation if anybody wants to reference back to it. And then in tier 2, there are substantially more, and there are about 22 metrics under tier 2 for site plan in those category areas. Next slide. And then plan of subdivision, we have essentially 3 metrics that the community energy plan is aimed at covering both energy and resiliency. So 3 metrics under tier 1 and 5 metrics under tier 2. Next slide. And in terms of implementation, the high performance development standard was approved by council in April of this year. At this point, we're starting to identify the high performance development standard through the pre-consultation application process. In June of this year, as Councillor Moffat mentioned, we're bringing forward a report to amend the site plan control bylaw to enable the high performance development standard. This is not functionally changing anything that was approved back in April. It's just to make the necessary administrative and legal changes to the bylaw to enable the standard. And then hopefully sometime later this year, we'll get a provincial approval of the new official plan, which will enable the high performance development standard to come into effect. At that time, the standard will be in effect with one notable caveat, where the energy modeling report will be report only, meaning the performance targets within the requirements won't apply, and then those will be phased in on June 1st of 2023. And that's to help us work through some process pieces associated with the review of the energy modeling reports. So as of June 1st, 2023, energy modeling targets become mandatory, and there is an additional motion brought forward at Council, which will bring the high performance development standard be required for plan of subdivision revisions and extensions coming in after that date. And then we're proposing in 2025 to review and make an update to the overall high performance development standard. Next slide. Oh, I think you're going to have to just click through here. There's a bit of an animation here. So at a high level, we're working through the implementation plan and steps at this time. We will be reviewing and reporting back on incentive options in 2023, or potential incentive options in 2023. We'll be updating the green building policy in 2023. We will be working with the province to try and advance Ontario Building Code to help it align with the targets that we have set as a municipality. We will be working with our other partners in the planning staff to review considerations where there's potential for a streamlined site plan process to enable shorter timelines, and how the high performance development standard might fit into those processes. We will be working on ongoing monitoring and reporting through the climate change master plan updates, and we'll be updating the standard every 4 years. And that's it for me, so I can open it up for questions. Thank you for letting me have the time to come and visit you today.
All right, thank you so much. So do we have questions for Becca? Yes, and Claude, go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very informative. Just a few comments. With the identified, hold on, I have to go back in my notes. You spoke about tier 3, but you didn't define what it was. Second thing, you spoke to the standard fitting somewhere in between sort of bylaws and guidelines. Guidelines, in my experience, are already sort of vague in their application. So I'm just wondering, on a high level, is this going to sort of add additional vagueness, I guess? When you mentioned the tree canopy as a tier 1, I think, target, you mentioned soil volume, I think, as the only metric. There's other really significant things about establishing a tree canopy, including maintenance and year-round protection, especially new trees planted, say, on streetscapes are really prone to being damaged. The current requirement is 1 year of maintenance by contractors, and then they're taken over by the city. But it's super, super important to have a healthy canopy, and in order to let it established, you have to have those things in place. And I'm not sure if there's dollars being allocated for that. In tier 1, you mentioned tree planting. I think tree preservation is also very important. Basically, it takes 30 to 50 years to establish a good canopy tree. You can build a building in 2 years, but you know, relatively speaking, it's very high. So if trees can be preserved, I think that's worth adding. And again, looking at health and maintenance of the trees that are planted so that they survive and do really well and contribute to the forest, or the urban canopy rather. Finally, sorry, it's a lot of comments. For energy modeling, I don't know if you're talking about only buildings, but landscape resilience is also something that can be measured and could be an added benefit. Thank you.
Thanks. So there were a couple of comments and a couple of questions. Do you want me to go through your questions?
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of tier 3, so tier 3, we only have requirements under the energy performance metric, and that's setting the direction towards zero carbon buildings by 2030. So that's essentially what tier 3 is. It's just setting that long-term goal and direction for the energy performance metric. In terms of fitting between a bylaw and guidelines, this isn't changing what's in guidelines or what guidelines do. This is just sort of to help explain, because we don't have standards, and this is something that's relatively new for the city. This just to help explain sort of conceptually where the standard fits relative to guidelines, which are much more familiar as part of the city's planning processes. So it's not changing or adding vagueness or changing any of the processes relating to our guidelines.
Yeah, I guess if I can just add, it just seems to me that a lot of the guidelines are intended as standards, and perhaps that's a different discussion. But anyway, that's just a comment.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a matter of level of specificity is the main piece with respect to the difference between the standard and guideline, and having the measures within it be something that's highly measurable and then less subjective. So that's kind of the key distinction we're trying to make. With respect to the tree canopy and soil volume, so I did only mention soil volumes, but I will note there is a component of that metric that speaks to a 2-year warranty period for trees, for street trees. So there is sort of efforts moving in on that space, but I'm not the tree expert. So there are other pieces related to trees and the conservation of trees that are being led by other staff within the city who'd be better positioned to kind of give the overall context. So the high performance development standard is just one of the supportive tools that we're trying to use to address the tree canopy concerns. And then the last question I think you had, the energy modeling. I guess I have a question for you. I'm not quite sure what you mean by energy modeling and measuring landscape resilience. Is that to factor in the landscaping into the considerations of the energy model, or is that a separate process you're talking about?
It could be a separate process, or it could be part of a larger energy modeling goal where you can measure specific things about a landscape. That could perhaps, if it was part of the overall energy modeling or the overall target, it might sort of carry more weight, because trees and landscape are very often seen as sort of an afterthought and just to make it pretty, but they do have a crucial impact on urban health and people's health. So that is completely in line with city targets. So it might be good to sort of give it a little more teeth.
Sure, I can certainly look into that with respect to what the implications are or options are for embedding landscape considerations into energy modeling requirements. It's not something we've specifically factored in to date, but it could be part of future updates. So I'll look into that.
Good. Okay, perfect. So we move on to Mohammed.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's very thorough, and I think it's come up a number of times at this committee. Where are Ottawa's green standards? When are we going to see something? And Scott has always, and so it's great to see the kind of the beginnings of the implementation. I guess I have a kind of a number of questions. First, Toronto right now, as you know, is in V3 of TGS. They're this year, actually, if not already, V4 is in place. So they've gone through a number of iterations, and I'm wondering, just you haven't shared any metrics with us about what are some of the key kind of targets that, and be good to if you could share that. But just overall, where would you compare in terms of performance standards? The proposed Ottawa Green Building Standards or the High Performance Development Standards relative to the various versions of the TGS. Where would you say where we are in Ottawa?
So we're largely aligned with version 3. So as you mentioned, Toronto had an update, I think it was sometime May of this year, where they transitioned from version 3 to version 4. So we're largely in line with version 3. So it is sort of one version behind where they are, with the notable exception of the energy performance metric. Mm-hmm. So our energy performance metric, we aligned with their version 4 with adjustments for Ottawa's climate.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
And we produced a sort of line by line comparison for council that was distributed as a memo. So I believe that's part of the public content, and is something that could be pretty easily shared with you.
It would be great if we could receive the kind of, I was going to say, this is a great high level review. I personally have a bit more interest in just kind of looking into a little bit further. So it'd be great if they have additional information, that perhaps you can provide it to Eric, and he can circulate it to other members of the committee. I see a lot of nods here, so hopefully we can kind of take another look at this. You also mentioned that projects applying for building permit only are not, those are not applicable. So can you kind of elaborate on that process?
Yeah, so projects that are building permit only won't be subject to our planning approval process. So therefore we can't subject them to things that we're requiring through the Planning Act. So those projects are only subject to the building code. So it's really a question of our authority and the authorities that we use for the green building for the high performance development standards. So that's why they don't apply. So they'll just go through the building permit process as normal.
So basically, you're saying any project that doesn't require site plan approval will not need to follow any of these guidelines or these standards. Sorry, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So any project that's not site plan or plan of subdivision would not be subject to the standards, correct?
So by current standards, that means that it's so single family homes, semi-detached will not apply. This does not apply to them. Single
family homes and semi-detached that are not part of a plan of subdivision
that are not part of some, right? But anything kind of mid-rise or low density apartments of four units plus, those would be subject to site plan approval, I assume.
So yeah, it's whatever is in the site plan control bylaw. I'm hesitating a little bit to say exact numbers because I think there might be some changes coming as a result of Bill 109, which maybe you guys are getting other presentations on, but yeah. So it's whatever is subject to site plan control. So generally that would be mid-rise, high-rise commercial. Yeah.
Right. And just in terms of incentives and offsets, is the city, like, what is the, I mean, what about projects that far exceed this and really have ambitious goals and are really, but I mean, to do that, they are, are there incentives that are offered? Are there ways that the city is rewarding developments and designs that are kind of going above and beyond and kind of reaching really for standards that, set the bar high?
At this moment, there's no incentives available, but we're going to be looking at what options are that we could bring to the table and be reporting back on that in 2023. So hopefully we'll have something to speak to that kind of next year.
And so in terms of alignment, let's say, so no incentive in terms of alignment of these high performance standards with zoning bylaws. You're saying that's kind of, you're going through the current process of kind of aligning. Like, for example, I'm thinking parking. Like I know that in Toronto, that's a big issue for a lot of projects where with especially projects that are moving to V4. They've had to go back and recalculate a lot of these, but that's because there is, the standards are perfectly aligned with zoning bylaws. So is the same in Ottawa, or are there still kind of gaps, let's say, where you might meet one standard or might meet this bylaw, but not meet the standard, and then submit an excuse or a justification and kind of slips through the cracks, so to speak?
So how we address that is where there's overlap between the standard and the zoning bylaw, we reference to the zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw is what would be the sort of ruling authority on that. So as an example, the high performance development standard metric related to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, it doesn't set out, at the moment, it doesn't set out specific number of EV charging or EV ready or any of those kinds of things. It asks for the applicant to report on how many, on what they're proposing related to electric vehicle charging. And then it also references and must meet whatever's in the zoning bylaw. So at the moment, we don't have anything in our zoning bylaw, but that's something we'll be looking at as part of the zoning bylaw update that's coming out of the sort of as resulting from the new official plan.
So, and what's the timeline for that?
For the zoning bylaw update, I will have to confirm with my colleagues on that. I'm not 100% sure on the timeline, sorry.
Right. No, I'm just looking, I'm kind of trying to recall your initial timeline where by 2030, you're aiming for net zero. And, if we're waiting until 2023 to start the implementation, it's obviously an ambitious goal. It's kind of, but as and Claude was saying, there's a lot of these standards need a lot of teeth to really start to kind of engage with growth in the city and make sure that you minimize those ambiguities and these kind of vagueness that really allows some metrics to kind of slip by while others kind of get scrutinized, or at least certain types of project might have certain metrics applied to them, and others that might be more impactful to the environment might be able to slip by. So it's kind of, I think that alignment between your zoning bylaws, your alignment between kind of is as important as the standard itself, if not more, just to make sure that you can kind of move on. So my last question would be within the tier, are there categories of building types, or you mentioned that this applies to all projects? I assume you're meaning that development standard, but there are categories within these high performance standards for different building types, meaning you're looking at low-rise residential differently than you're looking at office buildings, different than you're looking at high-density developments.
So we tried to be as consistent as we could, but where it makes sense to have a different target for one occupancy type or one building type versus another, we do have some variation. So the easy example for that is the energy performance metric, which lays out as one of the pathways energy and thermal energy and GHG emission intensity targets. And those vary based on residential, commercial, and retail. So that's an example where we do have some differences, but other places we try to be as consistent as we could. So, for example, we have a sustainable roof metric that doesn't really vary based on occupancy type. There is some variability based on size of roof and type of roof, but not on occupancy type. So.
And I know, like, if you're familiar with the TGS, which unfortunately that's the only one I can quote because that's the only one I'm quite familiar with. But they have 4 categories of building types or project types that, for at least in V3, they might have increased in V4. But is there a reason why Ottawa decided to kind of lump all the different building types under one umbrella with these minor kind of adjustments?
So I think I'd have to look at what you're referring to specifically for the Toronto example, because my understanding is Toronto has they have two versions. They have multi-unit residential under 4 stories and everything else. And then within the everything else, they have an the energy performance metric breaks it out, and it breaks it out in the same way that we've broken out ours. And then their other metrics are consistent regardless of energy of building type. So that's sort of similar. Where we do have a big difference is plan of subdivision, and plan of subdivision are often but not always a very different development type in that they usually have a higher proportion of kind of low rise style buildings embedded in them.
I'll give you an example, like for example, there's the kind of cladding or opaque to glazed cladding ratio, for example, to outside of the TEDIs and the EEIs and all that, which can be achieved, say in a high rise, will be achieved very easily, simply because the core of the building is always so warm and well insulated. So, but as an added measure to ensure kind of that this building, we're seeing that there's a 60-40 request that glazing is no more than 40%. Was that type of metric really won't apply to a low-rise building, and they'll have because they'll have a lot smaller of a ratio of glazing typically. And so they'll have, they'll be meeting these kind of energy metrics in a different way. But I suppose I guess kind of additional I think Toronto has 3 categories. That has the low rise, mid to high rise residential, and non-residential, and then they have city-owned standard or kind of municipal civic kind of type projects. So those are the 3 categories.
Yeah, and so I guess how we kind of break it out is our plan of subdivision metrics, which are site plan metrics. And so site plan would be mostly mid to high rise residential and commercial. And plan of subdivision would be a larger portion of your low rise residential with potential small amounts of commercial, which would also have to go through the site plan process as well. And then we will be updating the green building policy, which would be the municipal arm of the standard.
Well, thanks for this information. Again, it'd be great to get if you have slide decks or more information or additional details, you can pass those on to Eric or point us to where to look them up. Would be very useful. But I appreciate your presentation very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I have an avalanche of information I could send you guys.
Send it off. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I did just email the memo that Rebecca mentioned that was sent to council on, I think it was April 12th. And then also there was, as a part of that memo, there was 4 appendices, and they've all been attached to that email as well. So that was sent to everyone that's here in attendance. Corlia.
Okay, first of all, thank you to invite us, Scott, to this type of meeting. I really appreciate this. And Rebecca, thank you for the presentation, because yes, we were all worried about this. I think it's about time that Ottawa put the energy to achieve the 2030 défi. Sorry about my English. I've been speaking French the last 2 weeks. So I'm sorry in advance for all the English mistake I can make. But my brain has to switch. Thank you, Mohamed, about the question to compare Toronto with Ottawa, because I was having the same question to myself, because we work with developers and the standards for Toronto are much higher than the standards here for Ottawa. And that stressed me a little bit. Why Ottawa is accepting less standard than Toronto? We are 400 kilometers away only. One of the question is common area waste storage. For the big developments, like a lot of low-rise, mid-rise, and little houses, everything that goes inside. When you're talking about common area waste storage, it's that can we connect those site plans of what the city is planning for the waste? I know that the city is trying to improve and the connection and the dialogue with everyone. But for us as designers sometimes, or living outside the city, the connection of, okay, stupid comment. A woman says, okay, I'm throwing this plastic here, but I really don't know what the city is doing with it. I'm making my job to separate the waste, but I don't know what the city is doing with this. So that type of easy communication with the people. That type of thing. Another thing that I would like to do is the charging vehicle. As you know, I'm from Manotick, and now I'm going to have, each time I cross Lineback and I see that light train station building up, I'm more happy, and I wish I can go everywhere with the train. So if I have an electric car, can I go to that station and leave it charging meanwhile I'm going to work or going to downtown and coming back? And how this is going to be connected. The same way that now we have some rules to transform the existing houses to charge a vehicle. They need to change the main panel and how they connect. It's a lot of rules. And I hope if we can accelerate the implementation of those rules, that should be done in less than a year. Because if not, the time is going to arrive very quickly with 2030. And with all the mess that we're seeing now, first a big explosion of the market that nobody could find a house. And now the market is completely dry. So it's like, okay, please give me a standard line so I will arrive quiet to where I want to arrive. And to finish, so I allow others to ask, it's about the tree planting. And after the storm, the windstorm we had, I think that, I don't know, I think that we need more information about that, because a lot of trees needs to be replanted and to replace all the canopy that it was completely destroyed and all the accidents that happened. I know the new rules for the wings and the roofs, but that needs to be implemented now, not in 2 years. I don't know if you can. I'm not a very fanatic of how you implement it. I don't know how you can do it, but if you have a way to begin to implement those type of things now and not to wait. And again, thank you for this. We are all worried about. So it's a real important topic. And thank you. I think that Catherine, yes, someone else.
Well, thank you. And don't worry about your English. It's much better than my French is. That's always, it's good for you for learning the second language. With respect to the first item and the second item that you asked, so what is the city doing with the waste and communications around that, and what is the city doing with tree planting in response to the storm? Those two things are kind of outside of my area of expertise, so those might be things we'll have to follow up on with other staff as how we can address those comments
better with the people, because we know that we are recycling everything, and I'm putting the recycled garbage on the development wherever I can for the city.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And then with respect to charging your vehicle at the park and ride, so at the moment we have an electric vehicle charging policy. So I expect there will be some charging stations at the park and rides. So anywhere where those are getting constructed, and that electric vehicle charging policy is scheduled for an update as well. But so there will be some coming. It won't be every sort of parking space, but there will be some as part of future parking rides. And existing parking rides, some of the existing ones, particularly out in the South End, I know have some EV charging stations already as well. And those are typically pay for use.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cora actually speaks 3 languages. She's also fluent in Spanish. Tomas.
I was wondering, when you talk about tier 1, it's mandatory, so therefore there's a lot of checks and balances. But tier 2, you mentioned it's volunteer, and when volunteer, and if the matters that people are looking at has a cost element to it, then there's really no incentive for them to actually pursue it. Is the city considering looking at some of these perhaps more important volunteer areas and putting some incentives in place, either now or perhaps down the road, with regards to the new council and some of their perhaps focus on green energy?
Yeah, we will be looking at that and reporting back on it next year.
Okay. So it's not so there is going to be some incentives of some sort.
Well, we'll look into what the options are and what the costs and budget implications of that are, and then report the council and see where we can go from there.
So it will be addressed, in other words. Okay.
Thank you, Carolyn McKenzie.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much for your presentation. I had a number of questions, but there have been a lot of great comments and questions thus far, and Mohammed in particular covered off a lot of what I had wanted to ask. I just wanted to follow up, though. I just wanted to make sure I understood your response. Did I hear you correctly in saying that these development standards can only be applied to building projects that go through the development application process, and that's why they are only captured, if I can put it that way, in this case through the site plan and plan of subdivision process, and all the ones that just as of right go ahead, just get your building permit and get on with it, they will not be subject to this development standard. Did I understand? Well, I guess the first part, which is what's captured and what's not, and also that the city does not actually have a tool if it wanted to capture, to go beyond those two methods of capture, I guess, if I can put it that way.
That's correct. Both of them, what's captured and the tools available to us.
Okay, so which is a little concerning, I guess, and which brings me to my next question. What, in terms of numbers, on a percentage basis, what are we talking about roughly, just roughly, as far as what that capture might look like in terms of percentage of residential? And I'll ask you sort of in two parts, one sort of pre Bill 109 and depending sort of post, if you have, to the extent that you have a sense of that.
I definitely don't have the post Bill 109 analysis. We do have some analysis that was part of that memo that Councillor Moffat distributed. And I don't have the exact numbers on it, like off the top of my head at the moment. So I think that would be the best place to go and look at it. And really, it's hard to say because we don't have a crystal ball in terms of what the proportion of small scale infill versus higher density will be. And all of that is likely going to be changing as a result of all these changes from the new official plan and the updates, the changes to the zoning bylaw and market shifts and all these other external factors. So we did have some estimates as a result of what the analysis in that memo, but we don't have a crystal ball to really truly predict it.
Yeah, no, I think it would have to be, as you say, there are lots of changes coming up. So to the extent that history provides a guide, we've got a few years of history presumably we could look at, and I guess to give some indication. I guess I was, and not to get onto another one of the topics for this meeting, but in reading through, I think it's the loan program of council, which in the whereas, there was one line that really struck me. It says, which identifies that to meet the energy evolution, deep energy retrofits of 98% of all residential buildings would be needed to meet the GHG target. And 98%, that's a pretty high number. Now that's a retrofit number, of course, but when I start to think about, well, if we're not capturing buildings as they're being permitted and built, we already have a huge challenge in terms of retrofit. And if we don't have any way to get at those new builds, that seems like we're really just piling on to the challenge, which would make, and if we don't have a so-called stick that the Planning Act provides for us, that would make the idea of incentives, which have been discussed, that much more important, and or to lobby the provincial government as to how we can get at that. And so just a question there, is that something that the city is doing as far as talking to the province about providing the city with better tools through the Planning Act to increase that?
I will say, as
Yep.
part of the approval of this report at council, there's also the element that we're asking the province to look at the building code, right? So we can only do so much, and for many of the things that have as of right zoning, we need the building code to act on that. So we've asked for the building code to be looked at from a climate mitigation and adaptation perspective, to make sure that some of these goals that we're looking at, some of these targets that we have and measures are embedded in the Ontario Building Code as well, so that we can get to net zero, and that's a big part of it. So we do expect there will be some changes to the building code in the coming years. I'm not sure how far they'll go, but we do know they're coming. But it'll be a further conversation, obviously, with the province.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I can only imagine. I think, as you sort of alluded, how far that may go, but also how long that will take. And given we're talking about 2030, again, it probably underlines the need to really seriously look at incentives and how we can communication strategies to homeowners about who are getting ready to build, or smaller infill developers, that sort of thing. But certainly providing incentives becomes all that much more important, I would think. Well,
and you see that with the Better Homes Loan program as to when you incentivize just how popular the program becomes, because we've had to go back and shore that program up and actually provide more because it's so popular. You'll hear that from Janice. I don't want to steal Janice's thunder.
Yeah, no. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Mohammed?
Just a brief clarification from Rebecca. And actually this it's kind of a question that I have based on Tom and Carolyn's questions about implementation or incentivization of tier 2. So right now it's an optional tier, but you have a chart talking about that over time, that there's a timeline to adopting higher standards within the current version. So right now it's optional, but by 2023 or 2024, this is going to be the new mandatory requirement, correct? Is that my understanding of how those are being rolled out?
So the timeline piece, that's setting the direction so that industry can get an understanding and a long-term vision of where we're going, but that will be subject to council approval, and we'll be coming back in 2025 for that tier 2 update.
But the intent is that this is not a static standard.
Correct.
That you have these tiers, and at some point nobody's going to be looking at tier 1 anymore. It's now tier 2 or better, and then after that it's tier 3 or better. You can rename them but the idea is that it's a growing, evolving standard, and it's becoming more and more high performance as time goes.
Yeah, that's the intention.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, and I appreciate your work on this file, obviously, Rebecca, and I know that I appreciate your time tonight to come out here. I know you worked hard on this one leading up to Environment Committee and Council. There's a lot going on, and I know there's a lot of back and forth too between committee and council. So appreciate all your work on that and taking the time to come here and update our committee tonight.
Yeah, thank you, and thank everybody for your interest.
Thank you. So can I ask that the Planning Advisory Committee receive the update for information? Is it received?
Received.
Thank you so much. We move on now to the Better Buildings Ottawa strategy. We're going to hear a lot from Janice for the next little while because these are both her files, these next two.
Yes, thank you so much. Nice to meet you all. I think, Eric, you've got my slides, right? Here they come. So I'll start with the Better Buildings program. Better Buildings, this is for commercial, industrial, and large residential, so apartments and condos. That's the segment that we're talking about first. And then the next step for the next presentation will be about smaller residential, so anything that's 3 stories or less. And I'll speak about the Better Homes Ottawa program that you heard a little bit about there from Rebecca. So first on the Better Buildings side, the larger buildings, the council approved, sorry, so you can switch ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll talk about the Better Buildings strategy that was approved by council in October. I'm going to give you some insight as well into the benchmarking and auditing program, which is the first part of implementation of that strategy, and then how folks are getting involved and why they are participating. We did a presentation actually just earlier today at lunchtime on this same topic, so I'm using a similar slide deck that was used for the intended participants of the program. Go ahead, Eric. So the strategies, the Better Buildings Ottawa strategy outlines how we're going to make all of our buildings in Ottawa, all of our large commercial and multi-unit residential buildings net zero by 2050, in line with council's greenhouse gas reduction targets. We have a very strict, a very ambitious set of targets between now and then, including retrofitting effectively all buildings that are currently that currently exist, because most of those buildings will continue to exist beyond 2050. So we need to touch almost every building to make it much more energy efficient and change its heating source away from natural gas. So how are we going to do that? The strategy aims to answer that question. It focuses on the private sector buildings, not the public sector, including so that we're trusting that the senior levels of government, the province and the federal government, will be upgrading their buildings at the schedule in line with the City of Ottawa's targets, because our targets are effectively aligned. And the municipal buildings are dealt with under another strategy, the municipal building retrofit strategy. So they're not the focus of this particular strategy, but do understand that they are going ahead on a parallel track, just not under my purview. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is what our greenhouse gas reduction decline needs to look like. You can see where we were at in 2020 with our emissions. We've had a bit of a decline in 2021, but thanks to COVID, but we need to drastically increase the downward trajectory of these emissions. And so we need to touch every sector of our economy in order to do that. You can see where, although we're targeting 100% by 2050, I do like to remind folks that it's 96% by 2040. So it's almost a net zero target by 2040. And so we really need to keep that in mind, that we really only have about 17 years between now and then. Okay, go ahead, next slide. In order for how we're going to reach that target, the Energy Evolution Strategy came up with a map of, or a carbon budget effectively, of where we can achieve those emissions reductions. So we call this our wedge diagram, and it identifies 39 different actions that fit into these 5 different categories for emissions reductions. And you can see that existing buildings make up about 30% of the reductions that we need to achieve between now and 2050. So that large green wedge, or kind of turquoise wedge there, is what we're talking about today. It also includes residential buildings. So so the 2 presentations I'll be giving are what make up that green wedge there that achieves 30% of our reductions. Go ahead, please. So right now, emissions are coming predominantly from natural gas, both on the residential and the commercial side. You can see that on the left, the large segment of blue in each of those bar graphs represents the natural gas, the emissions from natural gas in our building sector. So again, the same story carries over from the commercial to the residential side. Natural gas is the main source of emissions. On the right, we can see that the end use of that gas is predominantly for space heating. That's the green bar in these 2 graphs. So space heating, Ottawa has a cold climate. We heat with natural gas. That's our main focus for our emissions reductions, is how do we reduce our thermal demand by insulating our buildings, and then switch away from natural gas to something more carbon effective, like electricity through a heat pump, or district energy through something like geothermal. We also, especially on the residential side, do consume a fair bit of natural gas or emissions associated with water heating. So that's another component for the residential side of the story especially, but on the commercial side, it's really a space heating conversation. Go ahead, next slide, please. So the Better Buildings Ottawa strategy broke down our steps into 5 components. The first one being benchmarking and auditing, and I'm going to be speaking most specifically about that today because that's the program that we've launched. However, the next steps are equally as important. Marketing, education, and training. So that's building both the demand side by educating the building owners, and the supply side by increasing the supply of skilled labor, making sure that those pieces are lockstep with one another. Number 3 here on the list is economic tools and coordination. Now there's a lot that falls under that. The 2 pieces that we specifically pulled out in the strategy under economic tools are a financing program similar to the Better Homes financing program or loan program that I'll speak about in a minute. We're in the process of developing something similar for the commercial sector, sometimes called the commercial PACE program, or commercial financing program, where that loan is attached to the property. So we're working on that component right now and hoping to launch something next year. Another component that was included in the strategy under the economic tools piece is looking at a community improvement plan, which is the mechanism by which the city can offer incentives or grants to building owners for achieving certain desirable outcomes. So you likely know we use this right now for brownfield development. We encourage brownfield redevelopment through providing tax incentives back to the building or back to the property owners. We're looking at how and if we could use that same tool for residential or for commercial retrofits. And we have a consultant right now who's doing some work with us on mapping that out. So that's kind of number 3. I will mention one other thing. We've identified the funding source for number 3. We're hoping to tap into some of the Canada Infrastructure Bank funds, which are quite attractive. They're offering quite attractive rates for deeper energy reductions. So we're hoping that that will offer both the incentive to go deeper, as well as the capital needed to achieve that financing mechanism. Number 4 is regulating and disclosure, energy audits, and emissions performance. So you might be aware that some leading jurisdictions like Vancouver, New York City, notably, Toronto has talked about it. They're in the process of this as well. These jurisdictions are all regulating emissions or energy performance at the building level. So New York City came out with this first and sort of paved the way for how the municipality could require higher performance of energy standards within existing buildings. It hasn't been done before in Ontario. Toronto has signaled that they're going that direction. Our building strategy also signaled that we're going that direction. And we're working with legal right now to design what that would look like. We suspect it would start with a requirement for energy for benchmarking and disclosure, basically giving an energy label to every building based on their utility consumption, and requiring building owners to provide that utility consumption. We could also include energy audits, regular energy audits, perhaps every 5 years is what was contemplated in the strategy. So requiring building owners to have a professional look at their building every 5 years and give recommendations for how to improve it. But the ultimate is really the emissions performance or energy performance requirements. And like I said, that's what leading jurisdictions are doing, and what Ottawa is considering alongside Toronto. And then kind of parallel to all of the above is engaging senior levels of government. So of course, what the municipality does really is dependent on what other levels of government do, especially the province. If the province does these things, the municipality doesn't have to. If they don't do them, then the municipality has to step up and do them. If the federal government puts some funding into the marketplace, perhaps it will cost us, the municipality, less, and vice versa. So, so there's a lot of different coordination that happens, and therefore conversations that happen between different levels of government to kind of support one another with the objectives that we're all leveraging each of our respective expertise and authorities in our jurisdictions. Go ahead, Eric. Okay, so looking specifically at the benchmarking and auditing program that's just launched. So we're asking buildings to disclose their energy and water consumption for the years of 2019 up until 2021. The reason we're asking for that range of 3 years as the first sort of request is because we want to see pre and post COVID impacts, because there was a big impact on the energy consumption in buildings. And we'd really like to sort of catch that difference, especially in the commercial space where there was a significant change. Go ahead. What we're using to do that benchmarking and auditing, so we're supporting building owners to identify opportunities to reduce their greenhouse gas and energy consumption through that utility data that they'll be sharing with us. By doing some comparisons between buildings, and we're working with a consultant that does this across the country and pulls from a national database, we can give fairly accurate what we call energy insights reports based on what we know about the building, its square footage, its usage type, its age, as well as its utility data. We can say kind of where it ranks with regards to its colleagues or its other peer buildings, and what types of measures might be recommended for that building based on its current energy consumption. This is a voluntary program. It's owner initiated right now. We are hoping to make it a requirement in the near future, but for now it's voluntary. We're targeting buildings over 20,000 square feet now, or 1,850 square meters. It's not a requirement that they be more than 20,000. We just think that's where the biggest opportunity lies. And 4 stories or greater is kind of the target audience as well. So it's not meant for the smaller residential. That's our separate program to deal with them. And then we'll be disclosing that information or their overall scores publicly. So we'll be making that available at the building level. So you might be aware that the province has what they call the Energy and Water Benchmarking and Reporting Program, EWRB, where they focus on buildings of 100,000 square feet or more. And they're actually required to benchmark their buildings or at least disclose their energy and water consumption to the province. That data is not made public at the building level. It's only made public in aggregate. So at the sort of 3-digit postal code level. And it also only applies to buildings of 100,000 square feet or more. We think a lot more buildings can benefit from this information and from this process. And there's a lot more sort of mid-sized buildings in Ottawa. And so that's why we're making this program available to more buildings and smaller buildings. And also the province's program right now is not, there's no penalties if you don't report. So we're trying to do this process to increase uptake of that provincial program, as well as disclosing publicly at the local level. So the two programs are aligned. They use the same reporting mechanism. It's just ours is making the data public and applying to more buildings. Okay, next slide, please. This is what the map will look like. The City of Ottawa has already included all of its buildings into this map. So that's where most of these data points come from. There's a data set as well from Ottawa Community Housing, I believe, that's included in here. And so what you can see is this map will ideally get many more dots on it, but this is kind of what you see, where you can click on any one of those dots and get more information about that particular building. You can see how it ranks against its peers. You can see its total energy use intensity. You can see some of the square footage information. So there's a little bit of information available for each building, and basically the high-level insights report is available. So the data that's submitted to through, it's called the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That's the dashboard or the tool that is used to disclose or report the information. That collects data at a monthly, utility data at the monthly level. So it's got monthly gas, electricity, and water consumption fields, and that's what the property owner would fill out. Yeah, so, and then you can see how it's going to be showing up geographically. This same tool is used across many jurisdictions. In British Columbia, they have what's called Benchmark BC, which is across the whole province, using the same dashboard, the same consultant software tool. So, so we're trying to align our system with many other jurisdictions. Montreal is moving ahead with something like this. I've understood that Edmonton is looking at something similar. Perhaps I think Calgary as well. Toronto is considering it, and there was a national, or there is still a national version of this to sort of pilot the concept through the Canada Green Building Council, and that's how we were first made aware of this type of tool, was through the Canada Green Building Council. Okay, flip ahead to the next one, Eric. So why would we do another benchmarking program if the province already has one? Like I said, we're hoping to use this to increase compliance rates with the provincial program, and also to like I said, add that disclosure element at the local level, at the building level. We think that's critical for providing information for tenants, investors, and stakeholders. And we also will use the data to then inform future elements of the strategy as a whole. Like I mentioned, the financing programs, the education and capacity building will be able to provide support, targeted sessions on various energy efficiency measures that we see coming up again and again through different through the energy insights reports. So we'll be able to provide that targeted information or information sessions. And then also finally, the regulatory side of things, we'll be able to use actual consumption data or utility data to define those thresholds of energy performance standards that we're contemplating under the regulatory side of the strategy. Go ahead, please. Next slide, Eric. The other kind of nifty thing that we're doing under this program is some thermal scanning. We're doing a pilot in 2 neighborhoods, commercial districts in center town, and then out in Canada North. We're looking at office buildings in particular, and we've hired a company called QEA Tech, to basically drive around with a thermal camera on the roof of their car, the way that Google would do. But this case, it's a thermal camera. They'll do this overnight at probably 3 or 4 in the morning when there's no people on the street, but also when the difference between the outside temperature and the inside temperature is at its greatest, and there's no sunshine to affect the pictures. We'll be doing this probably in November, so there's lots of time still for informing the building owners. They'll also be providing an aerial image, taking a picture from a drone to get that rooftop picture as well. And what this will show us, because we have such a demand for space heating, and we need to focus so much on our building envelopes to reduce that space heating demand, as we saw in those first couple of bar graphs. We in Ottawa really want to focus our efforts on improving the envelopes. It's something that the industry is not doing well enough yet, in fact, not hardly at all. And so we really need to increase our level of awareness and our focus around how do we improve our building envelopes and what benefit can we get. So what you can see here is kind of interesting because the building owner will not only see where they're losing energy, but where they might also have water penetration issues or some structural issues that might trigger them doing some more work on their building facade or cladding for other reasons. So we want to sort of bring those two conversations together to say, while you're doing that structural work or that cladding work, think about also how to improve your insulation value and keep that heat in. Because often these things are combined, right? If you're losing heat, you've usually got an egress or an ingress opportunity for water and things like that too. So we'll be doing this in the fall. We'll also, for the buildings that are in those catchment areas, we'll be providing them with an insights report as well, with focusing specifically on the building envelope. So where can they, where does it make sense for them to focus some attention, right? So on this building, you can really see there's, an opportunity on that top level. There's some problems at that joint between the top, the top level and the roof. So, so that, for example, would be pulled out in the insights report. We also are testing the concept of how much does a picture capture 1,000 words, right? So we're looking to test that out as well. So yeah, this pilot will be happening in the fall. If it works well, we might consider doing more areas of the city. And one other thing I'll say on this is we've used the same company. The City of Ottawa has hired this company to do a more in-depth scan of many of its buildings. I think about 20 buildings to date. They put the thermal scan camera on a drone and go up and down and around the building using a very detailed 3D image. And that has allowed the City of Ottawa to do some deep energy retrofit work at some of its own buildings. So we found this information to be quite useful for the city, which is why we wanted to extend the opportunity to other participants or other building owners. And further, the company offering this will be offering a discount for that deeper audit to any participants in our program. So that's another kind of hook for why participate in the benchmarking program. Go ahead, Eric, to the next one. Okay, so this is more for building owners. I'll probably skip over this. You guys don't really care about how to sign up, but if you do want to check out the program, you can see energy benchmarking at the City of Ottawa website. Go ahead, Eric, to the next one. I think we've just got, our Better Buildings at ottawa.ca. If you have questions about this particular program, myself and my colleague Erin Thornell are working on this program and we'll be responding to emails from that email address. The phone number there is Erin's extension, but I'm happy to provide you with mine too if you have specific questions.
Great, thank you so much, Janice. In that one slide you had of like the City of Ottawa buildings on your map, I'm in the dot at the very bottom of that right now.
Oh, right on.
I'm not sure how well it performs. It was built in 1976. So,
Okay.
Carolyn McKenzie.
Great. Thanks, Janice. Thanks very much for that presentation. I hadn't seen any of that before, so it's in an area that I don't normally think about big commercial buildings that much. But so I'll ask a sort of a similar question to when I asked the last presentation. Just given the applicability of this program, you had numbers up about this. I think this total square footage that it applied to in terms of the building size. What's roughly what sort of percentage are we talking about in terms of relevance to buildings for Ottawa?
So how many buildings would fall into that 20,000 square foot category or more?
Yeah.
We think there's about 17,000 buildings in that category in Ottawa.
Okay.
So far, the province has captured only about 80 buildings in their tool. So we think there's a lot of improvement to make that have voluntarily disclosed in the provincial system. So that's why we're hoping to bump that number up. Now, of course, the province's program only applies to 100,000. So that would only be about, I think there's about 600 buildings that are eligible to report under the provincial one.
Okay. And you said 17,000 buildings in Ottawa, and out of I'm just wondering, I mean, how that threshold was determined, and if there was consideration for going, what the 17,000 buildings would represent. Sounds like a pretty high number, but I have no idea how many buildings that represents in Ottawa. Is that on a percentage basis, what would that look like? And was there consideration for reducing that to make it more generally applicable, or is that already
You
a
mean
pretty high
from the,
percentage?
reducing it from the 20,000 square feet
Yeah,
size?
yeah.
Yeah, we picked that number because it was aligned with, we've seen other jurisdictions in Chicago and across the US with similar programs, picking 20 to 25,000 square feet. Edmonton as well has a program that's similar. And so that was the threshold that we thought would be of interest. The other reason is because buildings of that size, typically just through the act of benchmarking and looking at their utility data, they can typically generate 2 to 3% energy savings just having done that activity. And that usually the savings from that, that 2 to 3% is usually enough to pay for the engineer's time to go and collect that utility data. So that was kind of one of the rationales that Canada Green Building Council recommended. But we hired Canada Green Building Council back a couple of years ago to help us design this program, and that was one of their threshold recommendations.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. Very, very engaging. Seems like a really solid plan. I think I really like how it's systematic and it's really targeting what it can do now. With very realistic goals and very careful look at the very careful understanding of what's out there right now in terms of kind of building stock and really analyzing the contributions. And it's kind of telling to look at industry, let's say, which most of the public would typically associate with pollution and emissions, but when you actually crunch the numbers, certainly at least in the scale of buildings that your program is looking at, you recognize very quickly that residential is the biggest culprit, and I think that's kind of quite telling of the level of catch up that we need to do at that level. Now, just a quick question for that chart that you showed when you looked at the the emissions or the fuel types and emission based on sector. Is that only in like kind of a global overview of all residential, or is that particularly in that 20,000 square foot up?
No, sorry,
category?
those bar graphs were from our energy evolution strategy. So they looked at, that was following the building code and how the building code defines residential and commercial. So part 3, part 9, if that part of the building code means much. Basically, it's like 3 stories or less is considered residential, and 4 stories or more would be in that sort of more commercial side of those bar graphs. But well, actually, sorry, no, the one you're thinking of, I apologize. No, the one you're thinking of is residential, industrial, and commercial, right?
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
and in that case, apartments would be lumped in under residential, apartments and
Under
condos.
residential.
Yeah, so
But
in Ottawa, we have mostly smaller scale residential. We have,
that's right.
I think it's only about 17% of units are in higher rise. Yeah, this one here. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, when we look at this, just to understand, like, because I'm just looking at this and it's kind of shocking how high the numbers residential are. Is this kind of a global, all residential, or is this again just 20,000 up, 20,000 square foot up?
No, sorry, this is all residential. This is from Energy
All
Evolution.
residential.
So this includes all residential. So this
Okay.
would be, we have, I think, 380,000 or so residential units in Ottawa, of which the majority are in sort of detached or semi-detached homes.
Yeah.
Or homes below three stories. But what is considered residential here would include apartment buildings and condos as well.
So the reason I'm asking is because, again, as far as the impact that this program has, if we were to want to target it to have the most impact on these type of reductions or what we're looking for, carbon reductions, right now, out of this chart, let's say that the category of building types that are 20,000 square foot up, what would you say is kind of as a percentage of what you're showing here? What does that reflect? So you mentioned 17,000 buildings out of a total. I guess what I'm trying to understand is it's a great program. Should we be looking at a kind of a parallel program that looks at a smaller scale that perhaps in a city like Ottawa might actually reap more benefits in terms of kind of, picking up a lot of the slack that, Ottawa
Well,
is a
that's
small
my next
city.
presentation, Mohammed.
Yeah,
My next
okay.
presentation's on the homes. But yeah, I mean, for the,
Okay,
just for like
okay.
generalities,
All
we
right.
can say the presentation that I just gave is focusing on these particular ones, the commercial and industrial, and a
Okay.
small segment of the residential. There's about 70,000 units out of 380,000 are in what we call MURBs, multi-unit res. So a small portion of res, but then the next presentation I'll give is going to be focusing on the rest of the residential.
The rest of okay, all right. So we'll wait for that to get some more information. Now, the idea of disclosure is kind of incredible, and I think we've seen, for example, when LEED came out and everyone wanted that LEED plaque on their building, and I think it was kind of a great incentive for building owners to go after it. As shallow as it may sound, it was actually what they were after. They were after that plaque, and it's because they wanted to attract the top notch or top level kind of tenants. In a similar way, is there any discussion? I'm sure it's come up of advertising or publicly. So there is going to be a database, but to actually develop a plaque for performance that is stuck to these buildings. And so it's kind of, as a building owner or as a tenant, you kind of have to see this thing every day, even for the public walking up and down the street. You're talking about generating a culture of awareness. And was that at all kind of a consideration of actually part of this mandatory benchmarking is to actually make the results public vis-a-vis a standard plaque? And, that might on the plaque actually talk about where it stands in terms of the average in the city, so that, again, it just makes people think twice about renting a place in that spot, or make building owners say, hey, you know what, I'm losing tenants, or they're going to that building because they want a greener alternate. I'm going to make an effort to kind of make these upgrades. It's kind of force some change.
We haven't contemplated a physical like sticker or plaque on buildings, but this benchmarking database would be available online for everyone to see, right? So in tenants or investors or the public could see particular buildings. There might be a reason to make those stickers or something visible from the street.
Yeah.
We'd have to probably update them every year, so it would be a little bit, you'd always kind of one step behind, but that might be something that we look at doing. Yeah.
So okay, I can, for myself, I would definitely support that. I think it would really it would create a culture of awareness, and it would really put it out there, because not everyone might be aware of these databases and these tools, and you'd have to be really seeking that information for it to access it. But if we found a way to really make it accessible to everyone walking on the street, everyone walking in and out of a building, I think it'll have a far greater impact.
On the residential side, we're looking at incorporating it into the realtor.ca website or dashboard. So that we think is going to make it really accessible for residential. But on the commercial side, the same, it doesn't quite exist. Realtor.ca isn't used as much for commercial buildings. So yeah, your comment is well taken, and might be worth doing as part of our education program.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of tying into the previous presentation, is there a way? So with this benchmarking, we have the high performance building standards that have these metrics, and buildings need to meet the metrics, theoretical metrics, to kind of gain site plan approval and to gain the ability to proceed with their project. Obviously, we all know things change during construction, and things change over time with maintenance. And how does this program, as it benchmark, how does it tie? Is there a way, for example, to penalize buildings that are not reaching the targets that they were meant to reach with the high performance building standards? Are you synchronized with the high performance building programs standards, so that you work together? So they're number one, you're step two, and there's a feedback, and there's a kind of a really again, building owners really need to make sure that they're meeting the commitments that they've made with their applications.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca and I definitely work close together on our work. There's definitely a plan for buildings that are through the high performance development standard where they're approved through that, to have them show up on this map as a specific sort of segment that you could identify to say which ones have been built under the high performance requirements. And then in terms of the regulatory or the penalties for follow-up, we would include that as part of our, like, that hasn't been approved yet by council, and legal is still considering what are the city's authorities, right? When it comes to building code requirements, that's not something the city has authority over, but yes, we are looking at how can we tie that. That would more be captured under our own energy and emissions standards, right? That we're contemplating, that I said as part of the strategy, step 4 of the strategy. But yeah, we expect to come back to council with a full sort of phase-in report of some of those regulatory pieces by mid-year next year.
Because we know, like, you know, a lot of the certification programs, as you know, for buildings require that monitoring and reporting, just to, again, to ensure that from theory to practice there is that, you know, that and I suppose in you know, it would be that one would think that the standards, you know, the city building standards, the high performance standard, would fall under a similar kind of requirement, that there'd be a need to follow up and to kind of demonstrate through practice that these buildings meet their design standards.
Yeah, good point, Mohammed.
And then just finally, last, again, quite shocking but not surprising to kind of see the, you know, fossil fuels is obviously kind of the number one kind of, you know, carbon emitting issue. I know that, you know, again, I always use it as a reference because to me it was such a bold kind of move when the municipality of Vancouver kind of banned the use of fossil fuel appliances for new developments of a certain scale. And again, I think what that did is that I mean, obviously they have a different climate. They're able to use air source heat pumps. They're able to use technologies that are better suited for milder winters. I'm just wondering if, you know, what are we going to do about this? Like, I mean, really, it's one thing to think about envelopes, but ultimately there's going to be a certain limit to what an envelope can do. And I think we, you know, a lot of what we need to do is to be looking at alternate sources. And that's really only going to happen when people start going out to the market to get this stuff. And again, is there is anything being tabled to kind of start to look at certain scales of building that are just prohibited from using fossil fuel appliances, or that there's a mix, you know, there's a kind of a, you know, a certain mix of fossil fuel to kind of electric appliances in new builds.
Yeah, if only it were so easy, Mohammed. We would love that. But the municipalities are not allowed to regulate the fuel utilities or energy utilities. That's a provincial jurisdiction very clearly. We don't have any authority over Enbridge or even really Hydro Ottawa, even though we own them. We don't have authority over their operations. That said, what I mentioned before about the building performance standards is where the city has some level of authority. Possibly it's never been used before, like I said, in Ontario, but that would be another way to come about the same thing, which is to say buildings must achieve a certain energy or emissions performance, and how they achieve that is up to them. But they would be fairly clear that fossil fuels wouldn't be that wouldn't be a possible conducive path to compliance, right? So.
Pretty sure Vancouver, I can look up the reference, but I'm pretty sure it was the city of Vancouver. So again, British Columbia might have different.
The city of Vancouver has their own building code, which is what gives them specific authority. They have a city of Vancouver charter. City of Ottawa doesn't have that, unfortunately.
Okay. That's all my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Shannon Bassett.
It was a general question, more maybe broader question, when you were talking about looking at the energy use in a lot of, I guess, the commercial buildings that weren't being used at the beginning and height or duration of the pandemic. And I'm wondering, like, I'm imagining there's a lot of vacancies still in terms of like commercial spaces. I mean, I know the Place Portage, which is on the other side of the river, like those government buildings, my understanding are not being reoccupied currently, or, you know, they're looking at different like hubs around the city, or the nature of work is also changing because, you know, some people are telecommuting or working at home. So you know, are there these buildings that are basically not occupied or vacancies, but still using energy? And is that triggering from the city looking at changing like land use? Or could you talk about that? Like those vacancies that are still being heated or cooled, but are, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Shannon. Yeah, a lot of buildings, commercial buildings, especially office buildings in particular, of which Ottawa has a lot of our commercial space. The vast majority of them are offices. Those are under serious flux right now. We've seen some being sold for condos or residential use, conversions. That might continue, I suspect. But yeah, this is why it's kind of a really key opportunity right now to get in front of them and say, as you're thinking about new use patterns or upgrades to your building to bring those tenants back or shift to different tenant splits, think about your energy and your emissions as well. So what we've seen is that the electricity consumption in office buildings has gone down significantly as people are not working, they're not plugging in their laptops, they're not using the internet. However, the natural gas use has actually gone up in a lot of cases because they're still heating these spaces, and they're heating them predominantly to the same temperatures they were before, but without the electricity consumption for the people inside. That's
Right,
not, they're actually using more gas because it's not providing the heat from all the people and all the computers. So it's kind of a sort of sad story that way. Unfortunately, the controls were not in place to reduce the consumption of heat in an effective way. But just goes to show how cheap natural gas is and how little, even over 2 or 3 years of empty buildings, it was just not a priority, right? So I think you're quite right. The City of Ottawa is, I'm sure, in groups that outside of the climate change unit, having lots of conversations about how do we work with building owners to reoccupy, to bring people back downtown, to make better use of our space. I know the feds are having deep conversations about their space and how they're going to transition work. I know it affects our transportation team, and our transportation master plan is basically on hold as a result of waiting for travel patterns to get back to normal or some form of normality. And so, I mean, I would ask maybe Councillor Moffat if you want to chime in on anything more that's the city as a whole is looking at in terms of land use patterns for some of those empty buildings.
Well, I mean, it's not an easy transition from a commercial building to a residential building. Often they don't have the same requirements and the same building code requirements for housing, and for residential. Bedrooms require a certain amount of windows and how those are built. And often commercial buildings, in terms of their shape, they're often in squares, and residential buildings, rental buildings can often be in rectangles because of the way that the room fabric fits into the building. So it's not always, it's just not that simple to transform a commercial building into a residential building. I think that's one of the challenges you're seeing, because we actually looked at a few things where we were looking to see if people would be willing to sell buildings, not maybe to us, but I mean to look at for housing. And there weren't really that many options. So I think it's a conversation that's happening. I don't think it's evolving that quickly, even though we do have these vacant spaces that aren't going to be used and may not be used. But it might come down to some of these buildings need to be torn down to be built back up, to be more useful space, which is not all that great either. But yeah, it's simply just not that simple. The transportation thing's a bit different. I mean, it's not the end of the world if some of the transportation patterns don't go back to the way they were, because we can then change our priorities in terms of what we're planning for from a roads perspective. We have roads that are planned for widening and whatnot that maybe we don't need to, and maybe we can focus on building a better network versus expanding the network we already have. So there's a lot there. So transportation master plan should be an interesting conversation in the next term, because I don't think we're going to go back to where we were in 2018, 2019. I think that's a good thing, because our transportation master plan and our plans are for capital works is based really on like 3 hours of traffic a day. We look at needing to, $60 million plus to widen Prince of Wales from Strandherd to Hunt Club. That's just for 3 hours of traffic a day. the rest of those other 21 hours, that road operates perfectly fine. So is that really the best use of that money? Or could we build better networks within communities to allow community connectivity to be a bit stronger for transportation purposes and transit and all that stuff? So there's a lot there. It's a big conversation for sure. Anne Claude, I think Shannon, sorry, is that? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Anne Claude?
Thanks. I just wanted to return to my comment and sort of the gist of it from the previous presentation. The audits, and I understand it's Better Buildings Ottawa. At the last meeting, there was a good conversation about a city goal that spoke to increased interdepartmental coordination. And so I understand that there's so many factors that are involved. But again, I'm going to just come back to any existing building site or development site. The building is only part of the land, and there is a land stewardship component that's involved. And like I said, it would be really interesting to see a landscape audit component to the overall audit, and how that then feeds into sustainability targets and healthy communities. Because I do think that's a really big part of it that's often been left behind. So I think it's just a really great opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. One piece that we're working on in parallel is, and I don't have anything to announce on this yet, so it's just for contemplation at this point, but is how do we decrease the amount of surface parking that's contributing to both heat island effect, water runoff, encouraging driving, especially free parking. So that's something that is on our radar, and as it touches on your land use component. If we get rid of parking lots, we might have more room for trees or permeable spaces, or just more infill, and keep our cities denser. So that is something that's on our radar, and we're working with many other departments on who are implicated in that conversation, parking management, planning, and so on. But I don't have anything specifically to announce just yet on that piece. You can see actually that the Mayor of Ottawa did send a letter to the Minister of Transportation at the provincial level, asking for some authorities around taxes regarding parking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is all interrelated, and it would be challenging to expand it, but I think it could be really interesting as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Anne-Claude.
All right, so it looks like that's obviously Janice is here for the next presentation too, which I know we kind of touched on a little bit, because obviously there's a lot of interrelationship between when we talk about these two items. But I don't think there's any other questions on this one. So can we receive this update for information? Received. Thank you very much. Okay, so now item 3, Better Homes Loan Program.
Okay, Eric, next presentation, please. And I know you're probably all. We wrap up around 7:30, maybe. I'll try to keep this one short and sweet.
Whatever happens.
Whatever happens. Okay.
Just
so
one minute, please, for the.
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Just asking for a minute, but if you, given that you're speaking, maybe I shouldn't have.
Okay, sure, no problem. Yeah, the residential component, the Better Homes Loan Program, is focusing on that residential side of the equation. There's, call it 380,000 units in Ottawa, of which 70,000 or so are in multi-unit residential buildings, mostly condos, and the balance are in some smaller rise. So that's what we're talking about here, is kind of 300,000 homes. How do we get them off? How do we get them off natural gas and more energy efficient? So we're calling this the Better Homes Ottawa Loan Program. Go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this fits into our energy evolution targets. I'll skip through some slides that look pretty similar to the last presentation. You'll hear a bit about the program design, some of the results to date. We launched the program in November, so we've got some results under our belt. Some of the lessons learned, our program recapitalization that Councillor Moffat alluded to, and then, no panel discussion on this piece, but discussion from you folks. Go ahead, next slide, Eric. So this slide you've seen. So again, we're talking about the existing buildings wedge. We need to get about 30% of emissions from that wedge, of which residential is the majority, in fact, but there is commercial and industrial in there. Go ahead, next slide. You've seen this one, so we can probably just skip ahead. We've talked about that one in great detail. I think you understand that well. Okay, so here's where the rubber hits the road. So in order to meet those targets and that nice wedge diagram, we need to retrofit 90,000 buildings, residential homes by 2030. And if that's not enough, we need to achieve 327,000 retrofits by 2040. So that's what we're talking about in terms of scale. And when we say retrofit, we don't mean doing a bit of insulation in the attic and caulking around the windows. We mean deep energy retrofits. We need to achieve, on average, 70% thermal savings. 70%, that means adding 2 inches of insulation around every building effectively. And we need to achieve electrical savings of about 30% before fuel switching. Those electrical savings are easier to imagine. That's through more efficient appliances, better lights, but it's the thermal savings that is really the challenge to think about. And then not only that, but we also then have to switch all of the natural gas furnaces out for heat pumps by 2040. So that's 500,000 heat pumps that needs to be installed by 2040. And while we're at it, we're going to put about 20% of roofs, 1 in 5 are going to have a rooftop solar system, solar photovoltaic unit on the roof. So by 2050. So this is what our team is trying to tackle. Go ahead, next slide. So we've got off to a rapid start, thankfully, although still only a very small drop in a very big bucket. But so far, so we launched the Better Homes Ottawa Loan Program in November. We had $12 million secured for the initial launch. It's for all small residential buildings. So Part 9 of the building code, basically 3 stories or less. So we got some funding from Federation of Canadian Municipalities, a nice loan from them at 0% interest, and a nice grant to accompany that too. We then blew through that money in about 3 months. So there was tons of uptake, tons of demand, a huge waiting list. And so we went back to council and said, please council, can we have some more? And they approved us up to another 30 million in debt capital or loan capital that we could, that staff was authorized to seek to cover us hopefully until council resumes in the spring of, or in the winter of 2023. So we have now, with finance, I've been working on securing the first $15 million tranche of that debt capital to be able to reopen the program. It's currently on hold because of the oversubscription. So yeah, let's just see. So it's using the local improvement charge mechanism, which is a mechanism unique to the municipality. Basically, it allows the municipality to put a priority lien on the property for the value of the loan. So if we lend a building owner $40,000, we then put a lien against their property for that $40,000, and they pay that back through their property tax bill until it's paid off, and then it's waived from the property. So it's nice that it's a loan against the property and not against the individual. That's helpful for these long-term repayments. It's also nice because municipalities can also uniquely access long-term fixed interest debt. So although mortgage companies only offer up to 5 years fixed interest, municipalities can offer up to 20 years. So those are the two kind of selling features of our program and our sort of unique position there through the local improvement charge mechanism. We are following the EnerGuide, the Natural Resources Canada federal program. EnerGuide, it's been around for a long time. We're using that as the pre and post audit requirement to make sure that retrofits are done with some level of professional oversight. Our program is stackable with other incentives like the Greener Homes grant program that the federal government has right now, and other incentives that the utilities might offer for different applications. We also offer support by way of an energy coach to help homeowners with the implementation. So it's kind of a support line, someone who knows, your building and can help walk you through, making some tough decisions about what to insulate, which contractors to go with, and that kind of thing. Next slide, please, Eric. So the loans that people are able to access are a minimum of 15,000. We want to do projects that are a decent size, maximum of 10% of their home value, or up to 125,000 max. The rates that we're offering right now, the latest tranche, the last tranche was at 3.25%. We had the first tranche at 0%. That was very attractive, of course. The latest round was at 3.25, and we're negotiating something that's probably going to be more around the 4.5 range because interest rates have gone up that much in about a month and a half. But that's kind of what we can access. And like I said, it's fixed for 20 years. So it's a fixed rate interest, and we are tacking on an admin fee to cover the city's costs of 4% of capital. We are offering the 0% loan still to the low income qualified residents. So we kept aside a portion of that first tranche of money for low income qualified individuals. We're also offering them a free retrofit manager, so someone to sort of project manage the whole thing. And we're waiving for them the administrative fee as well. So if you know anyone who fits that category, please let them know. Where the definition of low income for us is the same as the Enbridge definition. So anyone who would qualify for the Enbridge low income programs would qualify for our program as well. And we still do have a fair chunk of that funding available. We are offering a fairly simplistic repayment option. It's sort of over, linear over 20 years, or pay it off all at one time in one lump sum. Often people might look at that as when they sell the home, they want to just waive or pay off any liens against the property as one of the conditions of sale. So that's an option. There's no penalty for that, but there are no other prepayment options available the way that you might have with your mortgage, for example. The city's just trying to keep it simple here. I mentioned the EnerGuide pre and post audit to sort of verify the work has been completed. We are doing a credit rating check in the sense that we're looking back at 5 years of property tax payment history and water bill history. If those are on track, then we don't do a credit check. If they're not on track, or if if someone hasn't lived in their home for 5 years or in the city of Ottawa for 5 years, then we do ask for a credit check from a qualified bank. We haven't pre-qualified any specific contractors, but we are offering contractor certification and training programs. So we are profiling the ones who graduate from our training programs, but we're not requiring that only those contractors be used. And so far, our financing sources have come from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for the first $8 million loan and $4 million grant, and Van City Credit Union, Van City City Investment Bank, Community Investment Bank, has provided an additional $4 million, and we're negotiating the next $15 million with Van City. Go to the next slide, please. So measures that are eligible is effectively anything that reduces your thermal demand, your mechanical systems as well. So your heating systems, as long as they're not fossil fuel based, they're eligible, and renewable energy installations, as well as electric vehicle chargers, can all be considered eligible under as part of the loan package. Go ahead to the next one. Also, we're doing water efficiency, so low flow fixtures. We can include some health and safety measures as well. So if there is a requirement to do environmental remediation as part of the, like maybe mold or asbestos as part of the work, then that could be an included capital cost, as well as any electrical upgrades that might be required to improve the energy efficiency. We're including some climate adaptation improvements to prevent flooding and foundation waterproofing, for example. That's also eligible. And we're encouraging actually the addition of secondary units, secondary suites, as part of this program as well. So up to 30% of the loan value can be for secondary dwellings, for adding a rental unit, because we really are focused, we want to encourage intensification and increasing of the density of living quarters as part of our energy efficiency, because where you live is equally as much of your, and how much square footage you live in is equally as much of your environmental footprint as your energy consumption. So thanks for that. Next slide, please, Eric. So what have we done to date? So far, since the program launched in mid-November, we've had about 617 people apply officially when the program was open, and close to 400 get their name on the waiting list since we had to close the program. Of the work done to date, or of the loans requested, we're seeing about $40,000 being the average loan request for people who are working their way through the program. we've had of the total, we've had about 2.4 million has actually gone out the door, has been requested, and the rest of it has been spoken for, but not actually gone out the door yet, because it takes time from audit to retrofit. Average homes, the average year of homes built is around 1970. So we're getting some of the older homes, which is good. Those are the ones that really need some energy efficiency improvements. When you look at the different project types on the right, you can see that air sealing there's a number of buildings doing that, which is good, because that's actually a requirement under the program that they improve their air sealing by caulking and weather stripping, because it's the most cost-effective measure that just makes everything else more effective by keeping the heat in. We've seen a number of solar photovoltaic systems go in. We've seen quite a few heat pumps, air source predominantly. We've seen a couple of ground source heat pumps, domestic hot water, pardon me. That's for a hot water tank using a heat pump technology. Quite a bit of insulation, windows and door replacements. We've seen a little bit of climate adaptation, and 3 places that are pursuing secondary suites as of when we created this chart. Go ahead, next slide, Eric. Okay, so I said we were recapitalizing. So we've accessed, like I said, we've got 8 million loan, 4 million grant from FCM. An additional 4 million from Van City was secured and spoken for quickly. And now we're pursuing another 15 million for the first tranche of a council approved max of 30 million over the next, that staff has authority to seek. So once we go through 15, we'll go back for the next 15. Aiming to reopen the program imminently in June. Hopefully, I think there's a FedCo meeting June 28th where I think there's a debenture committee meeting that has to happen before we can reopen. So that's what we're targeting, is an end of June reopening of the program. Go ahead to the next slide, Eric. So we're doing some things to kind of support the whole sort of retrofit ecosystem in addition to this loan program, where we're offering, you might have heard of our Rain Ready Ottawa initiative. That's a grant program to support stormwater management on properties. So that's a parallel program that my team is offering. As I mentioned, we know that skilled trades or skilled labor is sometimes difficult to access for some of these deep retrofits. So we've done some free courses for both contractors, so retrofit contractors, about some net zero training, as well as we've done some heat pump marketing and sales courses for HVAC installers to help them become more familiar with heat pumps and cold climate heat pumps in particular. We've also put some thermal cameras, or a thermal camera, in every library branch so that people can borrow those and do some DIY sort of scouting of where to improve the insulation in their homes and where they might have cold air coming in. Those are more useful in the wintertime, but they can still provide some insights in the summer as well. If you use them at night when the outside air is cooler, it could still provide some interesting information. We're doing some bulk procurement as well. We're looking for sponsorship, or we're talking to some heat pump providers about being sponsors and giving discounts on the program on their equipment, in exchange for profile through the program. And we're working with EnviroCenter on their Future Homes pilot project. So that's really focusing on community scale retrofits and how can we really bring down the price of retrofits if we focus on a geographically targeted neighborhood. So we're doing that in collaboration with EnviroCenter. And I should say this whole program actually is predominantly being delivered through EnviroCenter. They're doing the sort of front of house piece, the applications, the energy coaching, the energy audits, and the City of Ottawa staff are doing the on the property tax bill loan collection piece predominantly, and some of this other stuff that you see on the page here, the training and so on. Okay, next slide, please, Eric. Okay, that's the end of my talking head portion of the meeting. So feel free to ask any questions now if you'd like, and if you want to reach out to us after the fact, you can reach me at my direct email or at the Better Homes at ottawa.ca address. And then for EnviroCenter, they have Better Homes at envirocenter.ca.
Thank you very much. Questions for Janice on this one? Aileen.
Yes, I was wondering about how you are expecting that homeowners are going to be able to carry like a second loan in addition to rising mortgage rates, I think there might be some hesitancy to take on more debt, even for climate objectives.
Yeah, good question, Eileen. So what we're anticipating is that the energy savings will result in a net like cash flow neutral situation for the homeowner. So by doing the improvements and stretching those, amortizing those over 20 years at a low interest rate, we're expecting that the cash flow impact will be effectively neutral for the building owner. We're not guaranteeing that. It depends what they do, of course. It depends which measures they're implementing and their occupation of the building. That can change, of course, their utility bills as well, but that is the intention. But we do have some sort of checks and balances in there to make sure that we're not, you know, in a predatory lending position, right? So we have a cap of 10% of the property value is the max that they can borrow. We also have, if they're on the CMHC mortgage insurance program where they have less than 20% down on their property, then their max is actually 5% of property value, so that we're not leveraging more than the equity they have in their home. So those are some of the measures we have in place. And then, like I said, we have some specific options for low income qualified for folks who might really be in that energy poverty situation.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Just to build on that, would you report back to council? Do you have any monitoring on that element of the payback part to make sure that there is that savings and that offsets the loan?
Yeah, we can do some. We'll have all of their energy audits. We have access to all of the energy audits, so those make some initial estimates of energy savings dollar values. So in our report back to council that we're expecting a pretty comprehensive report in probably March of next year when council is sitting again. We'll be looking at some of those measures for sure. Yeah,
I think obviously I think if that's realized, that's just only going to lead to more interest in the program. I mean, even from a council perspective, to understand the value of some of these, you know, big expenditures on retrofits for some of our buildings. If you have the proof there to see that the investment results in a net gain in terms of your operating dollars or your expenses to heat or all these different things, it's going to lead to more support for the program.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we will have the data available to do that number crunching. We don't have enough people through the program yet to really see, but we reserve the right, or homeowners sign up to being willing to give us their utility bills for, I think, up to 2 or 5 years after they do the retrofit. So we can go back and do some spot checks as well and just sort of make sure that that our assumptions are true as well, to make sure that they're getting, you know, energy savings as well as financial savings.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Mohammed?
For that, just I'm kind of again, I think, you know, Eileen's question about affordability, because I'm looking at the program. Yes, you know, you're correct. There may be some homeowners will you know, be able to pay off that loan just simply through the improvements to their energy bills over time. Is that initial consultation, is it offered for free, or is this part of the energy coach? Is this like how do you encourage homeowners to, you know, go and access this loan and actually be convinced that yes, we've looked at your home, you know, these are the things that we've identified, and forget about your kind of, you know, trying to save the environment and try to kind of do your part. Here is the benefit to your, you know, to what, you know, your monthly or yearly expenditures, and it makes sense for you to do this. Is that initial coaching, is that initial assessment kind of offered for free?
Yeah, so the energy audit, that's the EnerGuide audit. That's the process that we require. It's not free, but it's covered under a grant from the federal government. So we help them apply for that grant, the Greener Homes grant. So they can get the audit cost covered, as well as up to $5,000 in grant to support their work, to support the capital cost of their improvements. So there's been a lot of people applying for both our program and that federal program to sort of build on the two, right? I think, does that answer your question, Mohammed?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's just initial access. That's I was wondering about, is that how do you get people really engaged in this program, or because yeah, it's unless they can see that and understand that value, and some owners might not even want to pay that. If there's a cost to that assessment, some owners might just say, well, I'll wait. And so no, it's good to know that part is covered.
Yeah, and we're working on some nifty sort of software tools that might give people some insights, just based on, because with homes, they're pretty similar, right? Homes built at a similar age operate fairly similarly in terms of their energy consumption. And there's a lot of great data that the federal government has that has been provided to us as well, to sort of archetype those homes. So we're working with some software providers to think about how could we give as much information to a homeowner before they have to do anything, about what they should do about to improve the energy efficiency of their home, just based on the age, the square footage, perhaps the orientation. We can give some pretty good estimates. Like, we know buildings built before the 80s don't have enough insulation. So starting right there, that's probably a top priority, right? So those kinds of rules of thumb are very effective in the residential space. And you can look to some other jurisdictions. Vancouver is doing some interesting work on this. Kamloops actually has done some neat work on this, but the maritime provinces are working on some interesting stuff too. And actually, most recently, Edmonton has come up with or is just about to launch their program, where they're effectively giving buildings an energy label, an estimated energy label just based on their age and square footage, and then encouraging building, and with that some suggestions of what they might like to do, or might benefit from doing from an energy consumption point of view, and some estimated paybacks. And most buildings of your age and your size would benefit this much per year from changing your hot water tank, for example, or changing your windows. And then with that, the homeowner would then be invited to either make the information more accurate, upload utility data, for example, and get that energy score more accurate, or go and get an energy audit and start the program of or the process of retrofitting. So we're working on that component too. I hope to have something flashy to show you in the next couple of months, but it's not quite ready for today's audience.
And just one more question. So this is kind of a loan program for building owners. Now, what kind of strikes me is that some owners who might purchase a new home that will have many components that are, of a higher quality and a higher standard in terms of envelope performance or energy efficiency and all that. But some new homeowners might not, and might actually be eligible, strangely enough, for doing some improvements to their home, with components that are relatively speaking new, but that might end up being swapped. Let's say, going from a gas-fired furnace to air source, and so all of a sudden you get this kind of brand new resource that is, I don't know, hopefully will have an afterlife. But have you thought of how that program, or does a program exist that extends this type of financing, this type of kind of incentive to home builders, so that somehow by the homeowners get a product that's already future proofed, and that somehow that extra cost, that burden is not necessarily carried by the builder, or as it's passed on to the homeowner, that kind of impact of that future proof building is softened a bit.
Mohammed, would you like to join the climate change team? Like, you're nailing all of our ideas. Yes, exactly. We're working on that. So Rebecca and I, as you can imagine, are working on through that exact concept of how can we offer our financing mechanism to properties under construction, so that they can go deeper, right? So they can have a more energy efficient building at the point of construction, using the high performance development standard as a benchmark or as a threshold for that, and looking at sort of construction financing. So we're working with the stakeholders, the developers, on figuring out the best mechanism for that. I can say there will be some proposal put forward to council when we come back to council with our full report in probably March, that will tackle that piece, and propose suggestions for how we would extend the high performance, the Better Homes loan program also to new construction.
We have a great resource. David Renfrew on the committee is also kind of represents the Ottawa Home Builders Association. Is that right, David? So I think a great resource to draw on for him.
Yeah, I'm the president of the Greater Ottawa Home Builders. So, I really appreciate Janice, great presentations. I think we all want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I've been very quiet tonight because, housing affordability is a very big problem for the city of Ottawa right now. And, the high performance development standards, added costs to a project. We all want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We all want to have a good tree canopy, but we also have to make sure that first-time home buyers can afford a home. Inflation's gone up, interest rates have gone up. We have, as I said, the high performance development standards. The inclusionary zoning is a special meeting tomorrow. Next Thursday, we have the community benefit charges coming up. DCs just went up 16.2%. The additional land carry with interest, as I mentioned, there's a new parks land first policy that's going to be at planning committee next Thursday. It's hard to try to find anyone that can afford all of these new policy initiatives, as well as energy modeling requirements. So listen, I think your presentations were phenomenal. I really do. If there's anything the home builders can do with you, we'd love to do that. I loved hearing you talk about educating skilled trades. If we can help you there, 100%. If we can work with you on new home construction, 100%, we want to do that. I think majority of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from older buildings. So I'm representing new construction. So if there's anything we can do, 100%, let's do that. Let's find a way. My email is on the meeting agenda. But boy, housing affordability I'm hearing all these great questions from the other panelist members, and I'm just thinking, who's going to pay for that? First-time home buyers, unless you're making $200,000 a year, you can't buy a new home.
Yeah, and these are all valid concerns, David. I would hazard a guess, although I haven't done the analysis yet to guess or to find out for sure, but I would think of the sort of 100 or 1,000 people who've applied for our program, the majority of them would have lived in their home for more than 5 years. They're not people who've just purchased. People who are just purchasing, like you said, are squeezed, and prices just went up a lot. And so that's difficult. But there are a lot of people in Ottawa who have been in their homes for 20 plus years and have a lot of energy efficiency improvements to make and have a valuable asset that they've paid off fully, right? So those are kind of the target audiences of our program to start. And we absolutely need to get everyone somehow. 98% of buildings have to be retrofit, but perhaps not those that have just purchased and gone through some of your some of the challenges that you just spoke about. So
no, you have tremendously ambitious goals, and if we can help you 100%, we'd like to do that. I mean, to retrofit 27% in the next 8 years, wow, that's ambitious. Also, the provincial government just came out and said we have to build 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years, which Ottawa is 10% of that number. So Ottawa has to build 15,000 homes per year to even contribute our share to that number. And Ottawa historically is doing 9,000 homes a year. So how does our industry, there aren't enough skilled trades to build an extra 6,000 homes a year, plus supply chain issues, plus the shortage of trades. And then we also have to do the retrofits as well. So it's a citywide problem, and I think if all stakeholders row in the same direction, we can certainly achieve more together. But
100%, yeah. Definitely a time to tell all of the teenagers in your life to get into skilled trades.
Yeah, but your presentations were phenomenal. You're very passionate on what you're doing, and certainly I'd like to connect with you and see how we can help.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Mohammed, for the plug here. I was lurking all meeting and just listening. Thank you.
Thanks. I know one thing you mentioned, the CBC, the community benefits charge, that does replace another charge, right? That replaces Section 37. So some things are coming off, some things come on. So some things, they might not be like for like, but the intent of CBC was to actually provide some relief for the development industry. Maybe it hasn't worked out that way, but that's certainly what the intent was when the province brought it forward in lieu of Section 37. because it was more recent. That was under this government.
That's, Counselor, that's a discussion I'm ready to have. if
That's
you
what
wanna
the
have
intent
that.
was.
I
Whether
don't know if this
it's
is
just
the
happened.
format for it, but Section 37 was an incentive for increased density, and community benefit charges will be going across the whole city, right? So it's not incentive based, and I think there's ongoing discussions now where there's general disagreement on what qualifies for community benefit charge. So those discussions are ongoing with staff. So it may not be appropriate for me to.
No, that's fair. No, I mean, it's like I said, CBC comes next week. I mean, I think Section 37 was misleading. I think it's misleading to communities because we set these numbers in our plans, in our secondary plans. We say, well, this is where the height limit is, and then we use Section 37 to increase money that we get to the community or benefits to the community by allowing the height to go up above what the secondary plan said. So it's almost like this weird form of urban planning entrapment. That you create this scenario where you incentivize to go above a height that the community didn't want you to go above, but then you dangle some money at them to say, well, it's okay because we just gave you this. Section 37 to me never made sense, but I'm just one person and I represent a rural constituency, so what the hell do I know? We'll go to Cora.
Yeah, I observed that you were very quiet, David, and I agree the presentations are great, but I have another thought. Why OCH, it's ambitious to arrive quite at passive house standard without a certification, but because they are thinking that they are the owner of those buildings for at least 60 years. So instead of like the big developers, they don't care because they give the house and 1 year, that's it. I don't care anymore. That's it. OCH is trying to look much more to the future because they know that those buildings, they will still be the owners and they still need to reduce the energy and the cost and everything. So all the money that they're putting now, the numbers, it's very easy to understand. So I understand that you're concerned about that. For the new owners, that's why we are trying to design houses that can allow the third generation to live or the secondary suites or all those type of things. So if they cannot afford, and we have to remember that in this moment, with all the technology we are having and all, we are like in this tsunami of change. That's the problems that we are having now. From now on, all the changes in technology and what it's coming with the changes for energy, it's going to be more available. And I agree 100% affordability in this moment, it's an emergency, but creating the secondary suite, so a house for 1970 that allows for the owner to retrofit the house and create a secondary suite so someone can go and live and have a little bit of a secondary little house till this balance between technology, changing energy, it's going to balance the boat again. We're like in the middle of the storm, the tsunami, it's the beginning of the wave. But I prefer the way of thinking of OCH. Their standard compared to any developer, it's clever thinking. They are retrofitting and all the new buildings they are planning are with a passive house standard, even if it's not a passive house certification. I understand that makes you have fear of all the mess that we are living now. But I think that we need to think in 60 years. And I agree with you 100% of your concern. But that's why we are here, trying to think. Thanks.
Thanks, Cora. I think it's a tough conversation because I think it's housing affordability is a big, I mean, obviously there's housing affordability and there's affordable housing. You can't really, often people conflate the two, but the tough thing is that new homeowners don't often think of the long-term costs of a home. They think of the sticker price the day of. And that's one of the toughest things to deal with. I think I mentioned it before. I might have mentioned it before here. A company I was dealing with that was building a building, and they originally had planned for a steel roof, which really fit in well with the design in the neighborhood. But they changed their plan through site plan to a shingled roof. And I asked them, I said, what? Like, I get you're saving some money on the upfront cost, but you're gonna have to replace that roof. Like a shingled roof, I mean, based on where you are, you could be looking at that being replaced every 15 years. That tin roof, I'll be long dead before you ever have to replace that roof. I mean, your long-term costs, your operating costs, your building would be far less. You'd be able to save that amount of money every so odd years. And I said, well, we have an envelope to fit in. We have a budget to fit in for this building right now. So that problem there with replacing this shingle roof in 15 years is a problem that we'll face then. But we have to fit within this envelope right now. And that's often the challenge you have for a new homeowner or any home buyer, is that I have this finite window to fit in for my budget and what I can afford. And that's often the challenge, is that how do you get a homeowner to think of, well, if you pay this extra money now, you'll save in the long run. You know, it's easier for the city to do it. It's easier for maybe companies to do it sometimes, but it's harder for homeowners. And that's the crux of the situation that we have. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't go ahead and do these things and try to strive for better. It's also why the city always looks to try to find balance. And we work with multiple partners, and GOBA is one of them, on how do we move into this. And we Rebecca was here talking earlier about the high performance development standards, and we compare it to the Toronto option. Well, Toronto's gone further than we've gone. Well, we could start there and we could fail, or we could start a little bit behind and work toward it and build up to it. But you have to start somewhere. And, we started behind Toronto. We started later than Toronto. Probably should have started 10 years ago, but we didn't. And here we are. But you start somewhere and you try to build on that. And it's never, the issue is it's never enough fast enough, but to some it's too much too quick. So it's finding that balance and where it fits in amidst all these other challenges that we hear today from David and from Cora and Mohammed and what Janice is talking about. I mean, there's so much at play in this discussion. Mohammed?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think, a lot of the presentations what we've heard today is really certainly starting with the high performance building standards. Really, what I hope we'll start to see is kind of an emerging understanding of the true cost of home ownership, and that maybe you do have to, people have to, maybe you'll end up owning your home 5 years later in your life, just because to be responsible, to have that responsibility to your fellow citizens, to your global citizens, that we kind of, as a developed wealthy nation, we owe it to ourselves to be examples. And that just might mean that it might take a little bit longer to be able to afford our homes, and maybe that'll also, I think what will end up happening, I hope, is also, as Cora was talking about, was kind of these programs might convince developers to switch to a rental model where they now start to think of building higher quality homes that they'll have to maintain for longer periods to reduce their operating costs. They're smarter, they're future proofed. And so you'll have a good stock of high quality rentals that are accessible to people who, maybe they'll rent for a longer period of their life, and then might end up deciding, yeah, I want to own, or no, you know what, this is such a high quality home. You look at the rest of the world, like nobody has these, this luxury of owning your home when a few years out of school applying for a loan. That's a luxury that we have here in North America. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So again, I think these are great programs. It will mean that we will need more skilled trades. It will mean that we'll need kind of, but it does ultimately reflect the true, with everything that we know about the climate and our planet literally burning up. It's kind of, these are the costs that we need to take on as a wealthy, civilized nation to be able to, compensate for that luxury and compensate for that ownership. But it will take a change in mindset that I think, starting with these high performance standards and really drilling down and making them work with all levels of planning, zoning, financing. I think that's kind of really what we'll need to be able to reach some of those extremely ambitious goals that Janice has pointed out that are, frankly, I think if anything, we should, there should be a lot of more panic at City Hall of what, if we're doing, is enough to actually even come close to anywhere near those targets. It's shocking to see.
It's definitely not, Mohammed. We know the answer to that so far.
But anyways, I think ultimately, I think what needs to happen is that the true cost of, and again, to look at these charts, it's, we always pin down industry to say industry are responsible for this and this and this, but it's actually the home, residential market and the smaller scale bills that are really contributing to so much of that carbon that we're, now going back after all this stuff is out there. We're trying to say, okay, no, actually, we can't live this way anymore. We can't sustain ourselves anymore. We need to scrap and redo. And so I think that understanding of what we need to do has been presented really clearly by Janice and Rebecca, and hopefully that will kind of, we'll start to see that conversation shift in the city. And with planning and development applications in the future. It's a hard pill to swallow, but I think, I don't know, it's just, we've got to swallow it at some point.
Counselor, I just have to give a little more context. Like I've kept quiet on some of this because it's, but the reality of what's happening in the industry. I know of 5 projects, high-rise projects, that have been shelved in the last 2 weeks because material costs have gone up so much. I met with a window supplier on Monday who said glazing has gone up 40%, just overnight. Glazing, all windows. So imagine a 20-story high-rise, imagine all your windows. That whole line item on that high-rise building for the glazing would be about $2.5 million. Overnight, they just added $1 million to the glazing cost. I have a project I'm actually working on in Canada, and steel went up 20% 2 months ago. So my project's still going ahead, but there's a lot of developers that they only have so much financing from a bank. And if the hard cost goes up, now, again, the building code is regulated and it is very energy efficient, not at the same level that Janice is talking about. I agree. There are many projects where you should exceed the building code and you should go to that tier 2 that we talked about with a high performance development standard. But the reality is our city is going to be facing a huge problem in the next couple of years with housing affordability. And if projects aren't being built because the hard costs are so high, we're going to have a bigger shortage of supply. And if more immigrants are coming to Ottawa and there's a higher demand and there's not enough homes for people to move into, they can't buy a home. I mean, this is where I hope the next term of council is going to go and realize that, I mean, we're all talking about putting solar panels on a roof, but shouldn't the priority be to make sure everyone has a home?
Maybe they can rent. Maybe the shift really goes to rental because maybe that is the more sustainable way of building.
So perfect. Rental is at below 2% in Ottawa. The rental vacancy rate is 2%. So if we add more population, the vacancy rate is going to be below 1%. Like you have to build homes for us to get out of this housing crisis. It's the only way we're going to get out of the housing crisis is to build more homes. But if developers can't even get financing for projects because the cost is so much higher, they just won't build. So I'm sorry to be a buzzkill, at 8 o'clock on Wednesday. It's just, there's bigger problems coming, and hopefully, this committee, whoever the future members are of this committee and other initiatives in the city, we can work together to find solutions, because the only way we're going to get out of this crisis is to create more supply. And if we create more supply, the market will balance. But right now, again, I'm telling you factually, I'm not making this up. Factually, I know of 5 projects, 1,000 units that have been shelved because the hard cost has gone up so much.
It's a first world problem for sure, and I think again, I think we can certainly afford to think more about home ownership and think about really, again, I think that, I understand what it's like to be a first-time homeowner and wanting to go out and get something and move in. It's kind of been embedded in everyone's psyche for so long, but I think really we've seen where that's taken us, and it's just it's an unsustainable path, and somehow that balance needs to shift from that rush to quickly go out and buy something as soon as possible to let's move into something that's gonna make sure that our children have a place to live in the future, and then maybe I can wait another 5-10 years to buy a home. But again, I think some of these things that you're seeing are gonna end up shifting that model from this kind of rush to own to maybe we rent and then we own and maybe we don't own at all. And that's and then if there's a demand for that, there will be. But I think somehow we owe it to our children to start that conversation, and that difficult conversation to tell people, hey, you know what, maybe you can't afford to own. The true cost of ownership is way too high than you can afford. You're gonna have to wait. And nobody's asking for private sector to carry that cost. But I think that what you're asking is that private sector recognize the true cost of building, the true cost of ownership to the environment, and somehow have that be reflected in the cost of housing. And I think ultimately, we need to be renting more, and more people need to find high quality builds. More developers need to be convinced that the best way and the best financial model is to build higher quality, high performance, residential that will continue to make them money over the long term. And that's a difficult in today's market. It's difficult, but I think some of these things that we're seeing might, in terms of performance standards and financing, I think that's really the only way that we can kind of realize those types of changes that need to happen.
All right, thanks. I think it's an interesting conversation. I think there will be a debate on council next term, but I think you're going to have there's two crises there, right? Which one's bigger? Because the argument for some is that there's no question that there's no bigger crisis than the climate crisis. Now, David, you'd be positioned in a different way, but like Leanne and you're not alone. In fact, there's probably more people that believe housing affordability is a much bigger crisis than climate. That's not a shock by any means. If you talk to climate advocates, they know that the people on their side is a smaller group than the majority. That's one of the biggest challenges that they have to create that. We had this conversation at our environment committee just a few weeks ago with Steve Winkleman from the Ottawa Climate Action Fund, talking about that and saying that the green bubble is actually relatively small. The folks that need convincing are not need convincing. That's probably the wrong way, but the target audience for a lot of the climate stuff is much bigger. It's about 85% of the city, because 10 to 15% are they're there. They're on side. So it's not that easy, because politics is often about the majority. Politics is often about populism, and at this point, climate action is not on a populist agenda. It's just the reality. So that's a challenge that you have, and that's a challenge the next council is going to face, because I mean, if you don't prioritize that climate, then you push it off. So maybe you have some short-term wins on affordability, but some long-term losses. So that's an interesting balance. Janice, you want to jump in? Yeah,
I'd love to just share one sort of stat that really brings this down for me, which is the downtown core. There's less people living downtown today than there was in 1961. And so I think when we talk about, and that's just because people are living in more space, right? Even though we've got way more high rises now than we had in 1961, way more buildings, way more dwellings. It's just we're now taking up more space in our living quarters. And so I really think that this conversation can actually be two sides of the same coin, which is how do we get more people living in existing heated space, right, to solve both the climate and the affordability of housing components. So that's why we keep really pushing the secondary suites piece and the element of sort of right sizing your building for your family unit. I think that's a big part of the conversation that's not really being brought to the forefront right now in enough conversations.
Yeah. But how do you shift a societal change in North America that bigger is better?
Well, bigger is better, but I think a lot of it is to do with people wanting to stay in their community, right? So people's they buy a house for their family, their children move out, but they want to stay there because their friends and their neighborhood and their hobbies are all in that location, or that's what they're comfortable with. So we need to provide housing that's of different sizes for different units, but in the same neighborhoods, right? Multiple options for people to downsize but stay in their neighborhood. So I think that's a big part of the conversation too, that that needs to be added to the planning side of things.
It's a big discussion for sure. So we lost quorum at 7:42. So Eric can probably document that we kind of proceeded more informally. It's okay because we weren't doing anything substantive. We don't have any substantive items to approve here. We weren't proceeding in a way that required quorum, in my opinion. So I think we're okay with that. But we'll just document in the minutes that we were more. We became an informal gathering at 7:42 rather than a formal meeting of the Planning Advisory Committee. But I will ask that we receive the final report. And
Received.
thank you. So that's that. Janice, thank you so much. I know you might have spent a bit more time here than you planned on it, but I appreciate you taking that time today. Is it are those real birds? You have like some sort of great like calming bird noise in the background?
Oh no, those are real birds. Yeah, just outside the window. Sorry, I didn't know you could hear those.
No, it's much better than David Wise was once here, and he has a habit of clicking his pen constantly. I can tell you that the birds chirping was much better than David Wise's pen.
I'll let him know to get some birds next time.
I gave him shit during the meeting, so it was okay. Okay, so thank you. So in-camera items, obviously we have none. Notice of motion, none. Inquiries, none. Other business, none. Adjournments? Carried. So our next meeting on the agenda is noticed to be, it says to be determined. It's very likely we don't have another meeting this term. It's very likely this is my last meeting with you guys. So just wanted to say thank you to all of you. I've appreciated having the opportunity to share this committee with you and further some discussions and whatnot. And I hope that the committee can live on, maybe even do a bit more. I think there's an opportunity for conversations like this to evolve and to help more of a bigger picture with some of the stuff that we did. I mean, even the conversation tonight, it might not be on things that are pressing in front of us because these are approved documents, but I do think that there's a place for a committee like this because this is much different than, I mentioned earlier that I did confirm that. So that the 3 items that we have today went to 3 different committees. And I can tell you that when we got there isn't as much balance that happens at committee in discussion than what happens here in this committee. Because I find there's a good exchange between staff and professionals and members of the public and members of the development industry at this committee that doesn't happen at standing committees of council. And I think it's beneficial. So I always appreciate it. I wish there's been more input. I wish there's been more participation for some of my colleagues on this, which concerns me for the future. How can this committee move forward if no one from council actually wants to be on it? But I hope that'll change, and I hope we'll get better representation, and maybe even through the governance renewal or the governance report that comes to the end of this term and approve of the next term, we can look at this committee and see if there's more opportunity for it, because I do think it's beneficial. And I've appreciated everyone that attends, and David and Cora and Mohammed, Shannon, thanks for sticking it out for the rest of the night here with me. But everyone that's on it has been it's been a pleasure. So thank you all.
Thank you, and thanks,
Thank you.
Scott, for your moderation and for the contextualizing, these discussions also in the broader picture of what's happening at council and other debates that are kind of ongoing in the city. It's, I think we're capturing a very small part of it. Some other committee members might be more aware of the wider conversation, but certainly for some of us who really benefit from understanding this and in what's being presented in context of the wider workings of City Hall. So very much appreciate your kind of your feedback and your moderation.
Yeah, good energy.
Thanks.
And thank you for your 12 years at council. I mean, that's remarkable. It's remarkable for what you've done for the city and for Manotick, and you should be very proud. And for everybody in the industry, thank you for bringing moderation and common sense to City Hall. It's so appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Very kind of you. All right. Thank you all. Enjoy your nights.
Thank you.
Left of it.
Good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Janice.